I'm Bob Schutz, and I have been a Christian since I guess it's about 1975, so I'm slipping up on 50 years. I'm a retired pastor. I founded a church in Cloquet, Minnesota that's still there. My wife and I have been married 50 years, have 5 children. Variously, at different times in my life, I have been a pagan when I was much younger. I think I was a Trinitarian for a while as a child. In midlife, I embraced and belonged to the Oneness Pentecostal movement through United Pentecostal Church. And ultimately, through the goodness and the grace and the mercy of God, came to an understanding of the Father and the Son that is wonderfully harmonious with Scripture and deeply satisfying and doesn't require any strain to reconcile it with the Scripture. My story, as much as I can remember at this age, I'm 74 now, is that as a child, I remember clearly thinking that there just had to be more to life than what I was just seeing on the face of things. I mean, clearly more than what we saw on television. So, child, you're watching TV shows, Lone Ranger and Zorro, and Ozzie and Harriet, and all those things. And I thought, there's just got to be more to life than what's in front of me. And it seemed very important to me as a child. Make a decision about how important is this stuff with God. Would you follow it all the way? What if you had to sometime possibly suffer for your faith? Would you be willing to do that? It was important to me as a child. I think God works with children and strives with children because we're open when we're kids, and of such is the kingdom. Well, anyhow, as a young man, went through high school and early in college, a good student, but a pretty reckless kid. Got engaged at the University of Michigan with the entire counterculture, a radical, rock and roll, drug infused, pagan lifestyle of the hippie kind of movement, and ended up going to Woodstock with some friends. Found it all empty. And then ultimately, I left Ann Arbor and went to the Upper Peninsula where I met my wife. I was a ski instructor at a ski resort in northern Michigan, and I met my wife. We eventually became married, and it dawned on me that in spite of having a home and a job that paid pretty well, and a pretty wife, she's cutie and great cook. Besides all that, she's a great cook. I was empty and profoundly empty, and I had searched around a little bit, things like Silva mind control. I guess that would kind of qualify as a science of the occult. And when the time came, and I was considering, what's it all about again? You spend a lifetime considering those kind of things. I was in Madison, Wisconsin. One of the other ski instructors at the resort that I worked at had a pottery shop in Madison, Wisconsin. And he said, Bob, you ought to come down and see my shop, give you something to do for a couple of days in the summer. So I thought, Tom, I'm going to do that. So I went down to Madison, Wisconsin, and I had a very profound religious experience there. And it was completely unexpected and not something that I was really even looking for. But I was walking along a park kind of an area above the lake in Madison. And there was a group of, I guess, sort of, you'd call them my compatriots, some counterculture, long hair type, tie-dyed shirt group, brown rice, the whole thing. There was a young man who was trying to witness to them, and he was doing his best to explain the gospel to these folks, and they were laughing him to scorn. They were mocking him. And I was not a Christian at the time, but I do remember being offended with the behavior of these people who would take this well-intentioned and maybe misguided young fella, but taking this well-intentioned man and just laughing him to scorn. That really offended me. And it dawned on me in that moment that I thought, I'm with him. And I wish I'd had the courage to walk up to that group and tell them to leave the poor guy alone. I didn't, but I walked away, but it made an impression on me. I think at that time I sort of changed sides. A few years later, maybe 4 or 5 years later, after I was married, I was on a business trip down to Minneapolis, St. Paul. And in the middle of a conversation about politics and the Vietnam War and all the cultural things that were happening, a young fella, I think he's cut from the same cloth as the guy that was addressing that group of hippies down in Madison, walked into the middle of the group and looked at me and said, "Yeah, but what about your salvation?" Well, at that time, all the people that I was with, they thought, "Uh-oh, here's a religious kook. Let's get out of here." And so suddenly I was left alone with this fella who was witnessing about the second coming of Christ and about baptism and about Pentecostalism. And I was just fascinated. And I thought, talk all night long, which in fact is what happened. I think we talked until 3 or 4 in the morning. And I thought, I have to go find some place where I can be baptized. I'm in. And ultimately ended up in a United Pentecostal Church in Duluth, Minnesota, totally dedicated, served as their youth pastor, director of evangelism, and was just telling everybody I could think of about this God of ours. And after a while, I began to get disenchanted with the whole oneness Pentecostal, not only its legalisms, but its brittle theology that to me was just as distorted. I knew that the Trinity was not true. I knew that because I had read the Bible through cover to cover enough times to say it's just not in there. That's not what it's trying to say at all. And I knew that the Trinity was a distortion like this. It was curved, but oneness theology was curved the other way. I'm trying to get my hand in there. Oneness theology was convex and Trinitarian theology is concave. They were just distortions in opposite directions, but they both had problems. And ultimately, I left. My wife and I had gone to a little town called Cloquet and established a church there, which thank God is still there today. I'm in regular touch with the pastor who was my assistant while we were working to establish the church. That took about 20 years. And today we are still in touch just about every week. John is the webmaster on my website, theologyallstars.com and wonderfultheology.com. So we're still in touch, with that, with our group and with John. But personally, I think I wandered, just wandering, because I couldn't find anybody or anything that really resonated with me and made sense biblically that would square with the scriptures about who is Jesus and who is God and how's all this fit together. And then ultimately, I was looking online at books about church history and things because the interest never went away. When I was a kid, I always thought, well, maybe someday some adult, some wise person will step into my life and explain what there is more than what we can see. And of course, that was just a child's dream. It never really happened. But as I was searching as an adult, I ran across Richard Rubinstein's book on When Jesus Became God. Now, the title fascinated me. I thought that's a great title. The controversy over Christ's divinity in the final years of the Roman Empire. And I thought it was really a fascinating historical read because, number one, Richard Rubinstein, not being a Christian, he has a Jewish background, essentially did not have a dog in the fight, in the doctrinal fights that plagued Christianity. He was not a part of that. So he could report dispassionately. And it was by the way, if you've never read Richard Rubinstein's book, you want to get it. But as I was purchasing Richard Rubinstein's book, I also saw on Amazon another title that got my attention, and it was called The Doctrine of the Trinity, Christianity's Self-Inflicted Wound. And and that was by Anthony Buzzard, who I've since met and is a wonderful gentleman, wonderful Christian man. And so I thought, well, I'm going to get that book too. And it was life-changing. Began to see and understand things, and scripture began to just click into place. Things just began to compactly fit together wonderfully. I especially remember the treatment that in his book he gives to Psalm 110. The Lord said unto my Lord, about Adoni and Adonai. And that was just magnificent. And I realized that I endorsed this biblical Unitarian message that people have labeled different things over the centuries. Some have said it was Socinian, or you name whatever label you want to put on it. But the essential message was that there was one God, one invisible, immortal, eternal, infinite God, and that his son was Jesus Christ, virgin born, and his only begotten son. It just, no, that's comprehensible. Ultimately, it didn't have all the theological problems and distortions of oneness or the Trinity. It simply made sense to me. And since that time, I have been trying to share that understanding with people that I know, my son, my daughter, friends, former assistant who's the pastor of the church in Cloquet, and others who are, and I think a growing number of people are coming to the understanding of who Jesus is as we do our best in our feeble ways to express it. So these days, I'm content with the understanding that God has given me. I wish I could do a better job of explaining it, and I write about it all the time. So please, if you get a chance, come visit my websites.